welcome to episode number 82 of the Geek podcast. And wherever you're joining us from, I really thank you. It is without a doubt because of the fact that you listen that we continue to do this and put in all the work behind the scenes to schedule interviews and create the show notes and upload the episodes, pay the hosting costs and all of it. And the reason we do it is because people actually listen. So the greatest vote that you can do is just to continue to enjoy the podcast, and we'll just keep making them. Now, if you've missed it, over the last few weeks, we've released a brand new update to the Geek app. And the Geek app is available on iPhone and Android, and also on your tablet devices, etc. And it's a free app, and you can basically go and download it and listen to the podcast, watch the YouTube channel, read the latest blog posts, see our latest webinars, look at the latest upcoming events, and all of that from your device. Now, the cool part about it is that if you listen to the podcast, and I'm assuming you are because you're listening to this right now, then you've got this really easy place to be able to listen to the podcast from the place where we actually make it accessible. So head over to your app store of choice, search the Geek, and you'll be able to download that free app. Now, in today's episode, we're going to be diving into a bit of a founder story around how the Geek website and so on sort of came to be. Now, a little bit of background around this, in probably 6 months ago, I got an email from someone who listens to the podcast, and they just wanted to know more about how the website founded. They just sort of stumbled across it. They enjoyed the content, and they wanted to know some of the background story around why I was writing this stuff, or talking about technology and phys ed and where that sort of came from. Now, I think in and amongst this story, there is absolutely some lessons around technology and where it's started from, where it's headed. And in the process of sharing this history, which was very much an accidental sort of path, I think there'll be some insight into the sort of progression that technology has gone on, and also where it may be headed. So strap in. If you have any questions about it, feel free to contact me on any of the social platforms. But hopefully you find this interesting. So to trace back to the very first interest that I had around technology, it would be well in my childhood. I got my first ever video game consoles and absolutely loved them. Obviously, at that stage, we only had one television at home, and I could only play it occasionally, but that sort of probably made me more interested in it. I didn't get sick of it. And eventually the internet came along, and that really changed everything. We got a computer, and we had the internet, and we had the dial-up connection. But it wasn't sort of long before I realized that you could build websites, and anyone could do it. And I remember that the internet provider that we got gave us some storage on their server. It was only about maybe 20 megabytes or something. And with that 20 megabytes, I decided to build a website. And funnily enough, the website was all about track and field, which was the sport that I was most passionate about. And the particular website was in some ways almost like Wikipedia, in that it was about all the different events in track and field and the different records that were held and the progression of those records. And I basically coded that myself using HTML, and really loved it, and built up this skill set around it. And then eventually, when I got to my senior years in school, so 17 and 18 years of age, I was proficient enough to pick building a website as my final oral presentation to my colleagues or my peers at school. And I proceeded to teach all of them how to build a website using HTML, and got great marks for it. And it was during that time period that the teacher said to me, Jared, this is something that you seem to really enjoy. You did a really good job sort of explaining this to the people in the class. How about you look at being a teacher. And, that really appealed to me. The idea of helping other people learn something and then also wrapping it around something I was interested in. So that led me on the path of building a career around PE and a second teaching method in technology. And with that sort of background story in mind, you can sort of see how that led me down the path that I'm in now. But, in those early days, it was super difficult to use technology. You had to have that high speciality and, interest in coding and building from scratch. It's pretty much the only way you could do it back then. Went through my university and eventually out the other side of it, got into a classroom, and that was the same time that tech was really starting to mature. And we'd moved from this Web 1.0 world. Now, Web 1.0 is the internet that we started with in the sort of, early 2000s, where literally it was a one-way street. You could just read stuff and consume stuff. But when we got to Web 2.0, that was the point in time where, Web 2.0 was starting. And it was right time, right place for me. I started a blog just out of interest sake because I thought, maybe my students could blog. And Web 2.0 came along, and it was really easy to build sites and comment, and it was becoming much easier for anyone to do it, regardless of your skill. And as a result, I started a blog and did my first post, and I didn't know what to write about, so I wrote about my class that day and sort of, how technology was something that I was interested in and how I thought definitely it was something that people should be focused on if they're looking to cement their skills as a teacher in the future. And you can go and read this post at the moment. It's called Sink or Swim. It's still there. I keep it up because it's a great little reminder of where this all began. But once I posted it, I sort of enjoyed the whole process of creating something, and I mentioned it to people. They went on and they had a bit of a look at the site, and they thought it was pretty cool that you could make a website and a blog. And then I made a second post and a third post and a fourth and a fifth. And, somewhere in that line, I must have got people listening and interested in it. And there was one particular person who left a comment on a post. And the comment said, "This is the truest and most brilliant thing I've ever read." Now, at the time, I remember sort of thinking, this is the best thing I've ever read as well. The fact that someone would leave a comment like this sort of inspired me to keep writing, when at the time I thought, this is cool and fun, but why am I actually doing it? And, that sort of propelled me to keep writing. I remember sitting down and dedicating my time in my holidays and so on to coming up with different ways to try new technologies that were Web 2.0 based back in that time. That we weren't talking about mobile devices because they were sort of pre-mobile device times, but we're talking about Web 2.0 tools, things like Poll Everywhere, which is still around, things like Utterly, which is no longer around. So a lot of these tools sort of came and went, and I used them in the early days to sort of explain how they could be used in teaching. But the cool part of this was that, and I didn't realize it until about 3 or 4 years later, but that particular post, the comment, "This is the truest and most brilliant thing I've ever heard," was actually a spam comment. And it was what someone had basically left on my site. It wasn't real. It wasn't a real person. They didn't think it was the truest and most brilliant thing. But for 2 years, I basically wrote assuming that there was at least one person that thought that it was useful and brilliant. And, within that time period, I obviously, ended up building up a following of people. Not great, not a huge amount, but enough to sort of motivate me to continue to write. And in and amongst that same time period, something magical happened, and that was social networks really began to sort of to start becoming easier to share on. Facebook was around at this stage as well, but it wasn't really used for that purpose. But Twitter exploded around about the same time that I started my blog. I signed up to Twitter in September of 2008. And at that stage, there was no PE teachers online. Compare it to now. There's so many phys ed teachers online, as you may know. But back then, there wasn't. And, to share the content that I was producing, I was literally just talking with general classroom educators. So if you look at the early posts on the site, they have a very generalist education theme. And it was sort of during this time period that I started to connect with some PE teachers who were also finding some value in being on social networks like Twitter. And Brendan Jones, who is still online, still active, was one of the first ever people. And, we decided that we would talk around technology and phys ed, and out of that became this idea of creating a hashtag that sort of was an easy way to communicate that sort of interest. And the logical thing to choose was PE Geeks, which was the name of my blog at the time. But at that stage, it wasn't the PEgeek.com. It was mrrobbo.wordpress.com. And I had just sort of, called myself the PE Geek based on a conversation that a student had had with me in the early days, where they basically had almost attempted to insult me in a sort of tongue-in-cheek way by calling me a PE geek. And I sort of ran with that. So at this stage, it was sort of right time, right place. Blogs were becoming easier to do. Web 2.0 was there. So a lot of people were starting to create websites and blogs. Compare that to now, the numbers are far greater. But back then, it was just happening. And at the very same time, social media was started as well. So I had this space to be able to write on the WordPress site. And I also had a place to be able to share the different things that I was talking about. So I did that for about 3 or 4 years, writing posts every single week, and I didn't miss a week, just talking about technology and different things. And it was very much pre-iPhone days at that stage, sort of 3 or 4 years, 2010, 2011, that's when the iPhone sort of started to happen for me on the site. And, I just sort of kept doing that, and eventually people got interested. And these sort of people were conference organizers. They were people who might have been running a conference around a particular topic, and they wanted someone to come and talk to teachers around, technology. So I ended up getting invited to those sorts of things. And the cool part was that you would get to go to the conference, and then you might have to present for a 60-minute slot. So it was a great way for me to meet people and level up my own use of tech and understanding, and then at the same time work on my presentation skills to other people, because I had no idea how to do any of it. It was literally, do you want to come and do a presentation? I said, sure, why not? And eventually started becoming quite comfortable with that and talking about technology. And at that stage, it was something I had to persuade much harder than I do now, in that, all the tech that we spoke about was way more difficult to access, more expensive, less available than it is now, and ultimately meant that the teacher had to be more invested. So it was very early days, and we eventually continued to do that. And at this sort of time period, I had been emailed. So we're talking about 2010 here. I'd been emailed by an organization that authored an educational magazine, and that educational magazine was called Active Education, and it no longer exists. But every 2 months they would release a magazine, and they asked if I would like to contribute an article every single time the magazine came out, and use that article to talk about technology and how it was being used in sort of phys ed and sport. Those were the basic brief. And they only said that every article had to be unique. So 1,500 words, unique articles, and I had to get them in. And, I didn't really know what I was agreeing to at the time, but it took a lot to come up with that amount of words every single 2 months that wasn't already on the blog. And it was some of the best work that I ever did. And eventually, after doing that for around about sort of, maybe a whole year, I think I wrote about 12 articles. I wrote a lot of them, and they never got released. And the magazine went bankrupt, or they shut it down for whatever reason. And I said, what can I do with these articles? They're the best work I've ever written. Can I put them on my blog? And someone in the email basically said, well, why don't you put them and make them into an ebook, and put it up and see if people would like to download it. And I thought that's a good idea. So I literally went on and started Googling how to make an ebook. And then I found that, I had these individual articles, but they didn't make a lot of sense. They were individual pieces to the puzzle, not really congruent as an overall theme. And at this stage, there was some articles that had been proofed by the editing team, and there were others that hadn't. And I thought, wouldn't it be good if I could get someone to proof all of them? So I found someone on the internet to do that. And it cost me around about $150 to get all the articles proofread and sort of made a little bit nicer and formatted appropriately to fit this particular ebook platform that I was looking to put the ebook on. And the crazy thing was that, I, at this stage, made the realization that I could actually get that money back by putting a small price on the ebook. I'd gone and spent the $150 of my own money to do this. So, maybe I could put $1.99 on the ebook, and if people thought it was useful because it had, 12 by 1,500 word articles in there, and, they thought it was useful, they might download it and they might purchase it. So I put it up as a bit of a test, and, I thought it was really high quality stuff at the time. I wouldn't want to read it now because it would be so outdated. But at the time, I put it up, and, I sort of went to sleep, and I woke up the next morning, and I distinctly remember seeing that someone had thought it was valuable enough to actually pay for it. And if I could know who they were, I would definitely thank them, because it set in motion a very different mindset around the Peer Geek website, and that we had an audience of people who thought things were valuable enough to reward us for it. And then we just got sort of really interested in producing material for the audience. And at the very same time that this was happening, maybe we made, $100 a month on the ebook, something along those lines. I ended up using those ebook funds to build my first ever iPhone app. And the iPhone was just launching at this stage too. So, writing about the iPhone, writing about how that was being used in technology in a PE class, but, had also made a couple of $100 selling an ebook, and then used that exact same couple of $100 to build my first ever iPhone app called the 12-Minute Run. Now, that is still on the App Store. It's actually called the 12-Minute Fitness Test now, and you may have seen it and downloaded it. Pretty simple app, but that particular app itself cost $500 to make, and the only reason I could actually build it and make it was because I had made an ebook. And the only reason I could build and make the ebook was because I had made these articles for this magazine that had gone into liquidation, no longer available. So if you look at all the different things that we do now, they all sort of snowballed and started from this particular point with an ebook, with a couple of $100 that we made from selling the ebook, and then eventually got to the point where we built our first iPhone app, which, like I said, cost $500, which was a lot of money for me to be sort of handing out there with no guarantee that people would ever use it. But it certainly, from this point onwards, exploded in terms of the possibilities that we were able to produce for the audience by building more apps and so forth. And in the next part to this little series, this 3-part series, I'm going to sort of explore the iPhone phase. I'm going to talk about what that meant for physical education and the sort of opportunities that I saw most PE teachers jump after. And throughout the next sort of chapter, we'll talk about how I got started doing the workshops, the podcast, and all the other different pieces of software that we produce. And the funny thing is, they all trace back to that initial ebook launch, that little side project that we made at a bit of interest, a bit of fun, that led to 100 plus iPhone apps and the workshops that we do all around the planet. So hopefully you found that first part interesting. If you have any questions, feel free to let me know. If you've enjoyed it, particularly so, leave an email, get in touch with us in social media, and we'll be back for part 2. Speak soon.